Well, welcome to our third and final class of our spirituality series, our annual February spirituality series. This class has been titled A God You Can Believe in, Your Personal Approach to the Divine. And this is sponsored by Temple Sinai Glendale's Adult Education Committee. And so just to recap a little bit, in these February evenings together, we've had an opportunity to explore our faith individually and as a spiritual community. We've had an opportunity to discover a variety of different Jewish approaches to the divine, which we will continue tonight. And we've been reflecting on our personal relationship with God, which we'll explore deeper tonight, looking at how we experience the divine in our lives and in the world. And as we've been saying, if people don't have a concept of God, that's okay too. We are exploring and deepening our spirituality. And by that, I mean we've been deepening our connections, hopefully, with aspects of life larger than ourselves, aspects that help to give our lives meaning and purpose, and aspects that provide us with a deeper level of engagement with life itself. And we'll definitely be exploring all of that more in depth tonight as we look at the theologies of Abraham Joshua Heschel and Martin Buber. And again, we'll have an opportunity to go a little bit more in depth with our own personal reflections about the divine and the sacred. But before we do so, let's begin tonight by seeing if there are any questions or comments about the theologies that we looked at these past 2 weeks. Does anyone have any questions or comments about what we've looked at thus far? Don't be shy. Any questions or comments about anything that maybe we've explored, we've looked at? And I want to encourage us, and I know last week it was hard because we're trying to get through a number of different theologies. My goodness, last week we explored biblical and rabbinical concepts of God. We explored Mordecai Kaplan's theology and Harold Schulweiss's theology, and we didn't have a chance to really spend some time, I think, talking about it and exploring it and even critiquing some of these theologies that we're looking at. And I want to give us a little time tonight if we'd like to. It was brought up last week that in looking at Harold Schulweiss's predicate theology, it seemed to be lacking a sense of awesomeness about God expressed compared to more traditional concepts of God. It was a really great point. And as I addressed it, I sort of looked at, well, what would Kaplan and what would Mordecai Kaplan and Harold Schulweiss say about that? But I realized that that's not what would be good for us to talk about. What would be good for us to talk about is what you think about it and how you're responding to it and reflecting on what may be some new theologies. So my approach is it's always beneficial, I think, to bring a critical eye to any ideas that we might read or study about. And that includes Jewish theology. And what I mean by bringing a critical eye is it's helpful to call upon our reason and our experience and our common sense and our emotions, as well as our intuition, to call upon all these as ways of understanding the world and our experiences. And to use all of that to help us respond to make sense of any ideas about God that we study in Judaism. So last week it was brought up that there seemed to be something lacking in predicate theology, and it sort of lacked that level of awesomeness. And it's a really good point. And I want to give us a chance to explore that, to explore any of the theologies that we've looked at that you're saying, there's something about this that doesn't land well. Because hopefully in this process of critique and analysis, we're going to discover what does resonate with us. So I don't know if we want to talk a little bit more about some of the theologies that we looked at that seem to leave us a little bit empty, or some of the theologies that we looked at that really resonate with us? Yes, Seth.
Excuse me, many years ago, I was taught that the first commandment, which we read is the first part of um, what the Christians have is one commandment we split into two. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Is actually a commandment to know that there is a God, not to believe in a God, but to know that there's a God. And I, on the specific topic that you're meant that you brought up, Rabbi, I don't know that there's a commandment that I be in awe of God. As long as I know that there's a God. But also I'm kind of wondering how we reconcile that reading, that is the commandment in and of itself, to know that there's a God. How do we reconcile that with many of the theologies that say, as long as you do good stuff, you're okay, which is actually the way that I feel. I feel that people, that if atheists are doing good stuff, they're probably okay. Anyway.
Well, thank you, Seth. It's a great point, and it's a great question. So in Judaism, one of the 613 mitzvot is, as Seth says, to believe or to know, that God exists. Now, some of the Jewish philosophers sort of struggle with that idea that that's a mitzvah to believe in God. How do you command belief? How do you command belief? How do you know there is a God? I mean, that's another great question, by the way. So first of all, how do you command belief? And if that's one of the mitzvot in Judaism, how do we wrestle with that? And then the other question, Seth, you brought up is a great one. How do we know that there is a God? And so let me try to respond with the second question first. How do we know that there is a God? And I'm going to respond to that question with a question. And I'm going to ask you all, how do we know there's a God? Okay, and one of the responses in the chat box is again, there is no God. So, and I think what that, if I can explain what that might, perhaps what that concept might mean is, so how do we know anything, right? How do we know anything? One of the ways that a lot of people know things in the world is through their senses and through their experiences and their observations of the world. So, do we know God? Or how about this? Can we prove God's existence through our senses and our observations of the world? Can we prove God's existence through our senses and through our observations of the world? Carol, I think I saw your hand, and I'm going to expand my screen so I can see everybody's hand. Yeah, Carol, please.
I'm going to go back to the prior question, that how do we know there's a God? And I really feel, looking back on my life and things that have happened to me, silver linings that I found, and I guess I feel like Mark and I are beshert, that he gave me things I needed in my life and would not have been able to survive without. and I gave him things in his life. And so I feel like I perceive God in our relationship.
That's beautiful. And we're going to talk about Martin Buber's philosophy of God is found in relationships. And it's a very powerful idea that when we look at our relationships and some of the most meaningful relationships of our lives, we're going to look at Martin Buber said, that God is present in those I, thou, I, you relationships. Every I, you relationship partakes of the eternal you, which is God. So in Carol's experience, and that's why I say, let's bring our reason, let's bring our emotions, and let's bring our intuition, and let's bring our sense of how we make meaning of our lives. Because, and by the way, this is the point that Rabbi Neil Gilman makes, who I've mentioned has been a huge inspiration to me. And you'll find in his book, Believing and Its Tensions, I believe he talks about this in that book. I've heard him lecture about this. But he says, the question is, do we discover God or do we invent God? Sometimes people would ask him, and he's he passed away, but he was a professor of theology and Jewish philosophy at the conservative seminary. So you can imagine he was getting a lot of questions about God, and people would say, do we invent God or do we discover God? And his response was, he believes we discover God in our experiences, or in our history, or in looking at the world, or in looking at our lives. We discover God, and then we invent our ideas or our images or our metaphors or the way that we talk about God, but that God is discovered through our experiences. Now, that's Carol, Professor Gilman would say, both he and you look at their lives, and you both look at your lives and you see God in that. And so what Professor Gilman then says is, the famous Hasidic quote, and I was trying to remember, Menachem Mendel of Kotsk said, where is the dwelling place of God? He was asked, wherever we let God in. Professor Gilman said, I don't see it that way. It's wherever we put God in. Wherever we put God in. So there's this element of us putting God in to our experiences for those people who relate to God. Now, for people who say there is no God, and that's completely acceptable idea, that's a way to read experience and read the world, and it's got as much proof and empirical evidence as belief in God, if not more so. But that is a way of saying, I don't put God in to these experiences. I call these experiences by another name, or it was between me and my husband, or my spouse, or my partner, or my child, and I'm not putting God into that picture. And as Professor Gilman says, it's really up to us. Belief in God, back to Seth, what originally was, but according to Professor Gilman, professor of theology and Jewish philosophy, it's a judgment call. He said it's like a baseball umpire. Pitcher throws the pitch, the umpire calls a ball or a strike. It's a choice, it's a decision, it's a judgment call. And each one of us in Judaism is empowered to make that choice, that decision, that judgment call. Some people are going to call it God, and other people are going to say, not God. It's the sunset. It's the Grand Canyon. It's my child. It's my spouse. It's the most important relationship in my life. And I'm not putting God into that. And that's to me makes perfect sense. As does saying, I feel God in that moment. I experience God's presence in that moment. Also, as reasonable as not. Seth, does that answer your question? Oh, Seth, you're muted.
I'm sorry. Not really. But
Okay.
But we can talk about it another time when
Okay.
we're not wasting 20 other people's time.
Okay, well, no, it's not a waste of time. It's a good question, Seth. Certainly in Judaism, traditionally in Judaism, the belief in God is foundational, and it's there. And as you're saying, in the tradition, it's a mitzvah to believe in God. But I guess here's my other response to that, and I may have mentioned it before in one of the other ones. So in Judaism, there are 613 mitzvot. One of them may be to believe in God. Now, there are plenty of Jews who don't keep kosher, who aren't Shomer Shabbos, who don't do a lot of the 613 mitzvot. And by the way, I think we got the number down to 200 because there's no temple and sacrifice for sacrifices, and we don't live in Israel. So Orthodox rabbis, you can go on Chabad's website and it'll say how many mitzvot can you keep today outside the land of Israel. I think it's between 100 and 200. So, but even in that number of 100 to 200, 150 to 200, even in that number, one can be a good Jew and a committed Jew and not keep kosher or be Shomer Shabbos, and they're still Jewish. So if you can do that, why not say, I keep the mitzvot, but the one mitzvot about belief in God, it doesn't work for me. That is certainly a non-Orthodox approach to Judaism, but that's Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionists. Those are the liberal branches of Judaism that say on some level, we choose how we live our Jewish lives, where we find meaning and what we believe. We have the freedom to believe and the freedom to not believe. And so a belief in God is one of hundreds of mitzvot. An important one, definitely an important one, but one of hundreds. Yeah, Mark.
Well, so what you just said reminds me of something you said many years ago, and was quite liberating to me, that you could be a good Jew and not have to believe in God. And that has kind of been central to my understandings and beliefs for many years now. And I think about probably the closest description of humanism and having a spiritual connection to all living beings as the closest that I ever come to God.
So you experience, Mark, if I'm paraphrasing, and thank you for remembering, by the way, it's nice to hear, for a teacher to hear that. You experience, and I'll use now Harold Schulweiss's term and Mordecai Kaplan's term, godliness. You experience the sacred. You experience the sacred in the world, in certain aspects of the world and certain interactions in the world, that you are able to experience that sacredness, and it doesn't necessarily require a supernatural being, who is above nature.
Exactly.
Right. So I hope I didn't put words in your mouth, Mark. But and by the way, I guess what I'm trying to do too, because I find it helpful when we look at different Jewish concepts of God to sort of categorize them, right? So the rabbinical and biblical understanding of God is that God is supernatural, that God is above the world, separate, a being separate from the world. It transcends the world, as well as being immanent in the world. And we looked at that last time, like the Jewish star, that the two triangles interlocking represent a transcendence and immanence, and that God is in the world as well as above and beyond the world. That's a supernatural God concept, and that's very traditional. And by the way, when I say it's very traditional, it's also something that a Reformed, Conservative, Reconstructionist Jew might fully say, yes, that's what I believe. I believe in a supernatural God. And as I mentioned last time, there are times that I believe in a supernatural God. And this may go back to the point last week that there's not a level of awesomeness for some people in a more naturalistic God concept. So there's supernatural. God is a being above the world, has personality, creates the world, interacts with the world, all those things. A naturalistic Jewish God concept is that God, divinity, sacredness is found in nature. There is nothing beyond nature. Nature is all there is. That was the point of Mordecai Kaplan. And Harold Schulweis took that to its ultimate conclusion in talking about God. And Harold Schulweis focused on the morality of God, as well as beauty and art and creativity and human creation. But everything is in this world. So there's a supernatural God concept in Judaism that we can all believe in or not believe in, or at various times believe in or want to believe in. And then there's a naturalistic God concept that resonates with a number of folks. So I think those are two good things to think about. Do you believe in a supernatural God concept? Do you believe in a natural God concept? Does it depend on what you believe, supernatural, natural, depending on the day of the week, what your needs are, what situation you're in, and what you had for breakfast that morning. And again, that's all okay too in Judaism to, have different beliefs about God at various times, because that's a reflection on what's inside of us, right? And again, if we can be authentic in whatever we believe and not feel like, oh, I must believe this, or I should believe this, or God forbid anybody finds out I believe that, I think that's the death of the spirit right there. When you cannot authentically state and affirm what you believe about life and about the world and the meaning in the world, if you can't do that, then you're being, like I said, I think that kills the spirit. So supernatural, natural. Then within those two frameworks, okay, well, what do you believe about God in nature? Or what do you believe about God being above nature? God as a person? Do you believe God is a person? That's another way to categorize it. Do you believe that God is a person that has being, that is alive in some ways like we're alive? Or is God not a person, more of a process, more of an energy in the universe, or in the world? So I think it's helpful to sort of say, well, where are you at with that? And then, do you feel threatened by certain beliefs or disbeliefs? Do you find a fear come up for you? And I would listen to that, oh, gee, I really believe this. Wait a sec, I'm not supposed to. I'm afraid. Wait, I can't. Do some of these God's concepts, are they frightening to you? And it's okay because what we're talking about with belief and faith is when something new enters our awareness, what do we do with it? Do we incorporate it into our mindset, into our way of thinking? Does it challenge our way of thinking? Do we not want to deal with it? Do we want to push it away? I think those are all natural responses to new ideas, and even as it relates to God. I mean, when I first, read, I did my thesis on Martin Buber, my rabbinical thesis on Martin Buber and Erich Fromm, and Erich Fromm was even more radical than Kaplan and Schulweis. Maybe Schulweis and Fromm were saying the same thing in different ways. Erich Fromm was a humanist, and he believed that God is an idea in our heads, and God is a symbol of the best of human values and human strength. In many ways, it's like predicate theology. It really is. But when I first read it, I was like, wait a minute. How am I supposed to assimilate this idea now? Erich Fromm was saying a lot of things that made a lot of sense to me. How do I assimilate this idea? Do I believe that? Sometimes, maybe. Not always. Can I allow that there may be some truth in it? Yeah, it took me a while to sort of be at peace with that. So I would love for us to have permission to wrestle with these concepts, to really be open and say, how do you feel about this? What do you think about this? You know, and if a concept really is going to shatter your worldview, then that's not a good concept. That's a concept to say, I'm going to have to set this one aside. And, you know, I don't need to incorporate that into my worldview. I hope that made sense. I want to, like I say, let us step back for a moment and think about how are we interacting emotionally and intellectually with some theologies that may be new to us, that are a part of Jewish tradition, as far as, I mean, a Jewish philosopher wrote about it and talked about it. Any thoughts about that, or was that a rambling? Yeah, Susan?
It's nice to know that in your eyes or other people's eyes, that it's okay not to believe in God, or not be sure of believing in God and still be able to be Jewish. Because I felt that way for many years. I'm not sure what I believe in as far as a deity or God or whatever, but I feel Jewish. I can't imagine joining, being part of any other religion. And yet I don't know if there's this all whatever God is supposed to be, because I have so many doubts because of so many things in life, and it's that kind of thing that it's nice to know it's okay.
Yeah, definitely. It is liberating. It's liberating to know in Judaism that we have the freedom to affirm or deny what's in our tradition. And by the way, this is when I work with people who convert to Judaism. This is one of the things they love most about Judaism. Oh, I couldn't think this way in my origin, the faith I grew up in. If I voiced these doubts, if I said I don't believe this or I don't believe that, I couldn't say that. I didn't have the freedom to talk about that. The minister might, tell me I'm eternal damnation. And that's scary. That's scary to think that, I take the position living in the 21st century in America that we have freedom of thought and that we have freedom of conscience, and that we can express that freedom of thought and freedom of conscience as long as we do so in a way that's not harming somebody else or trying to disrespect somebody or trying to talk somebody else out of their position. That we all equally have a right to have this freedom of thought and freedom of mind and freedom of heart. I had a professor at HUC who was a real devotee for a while, but his theology ultimately left me cold but he's speaking a lot of sense. This guy went to Harvard. He was brilliant. Alvin Reines, a blessed memory. I love Alvin Reines. And, at one point he wanted me and some other students colleagues of mine in rabbinical school to sort of like carry his banner and continue the faith of what he believed. And I was like, can't be me, because I like some of it, but I have problems with some of it too. I question some of it. And Alvin Reines' position that, in the liberal branches of Judaism, it's polydoxy. It's not orthodoxy, it's polydoxy, meaning that we all have many, many different beliefs. And in a liberal setting like Reform, everyone is entitled to their own beliefs about anything in Judaism. Again, as long as we're not trying to coerce or strong arm somebody else, and we're respectful of other people's positions. And he's right. I think that is Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism is a polydoxy. It is multiple, many different beliefs, approaches, practices. And, as a community, we determine what's out of bounds, right? People say, well, hey, I'm polydoxy. I'm going to do it my way. I'm going to bring shellfish into the social hall. No, you're not. No, you're not. Do that in your home if you want. You have the freedom to do it in your home, but we're a community, and a community creates the norms. and creates what's acceptable and not. And that is beyond the pale. So there are limits, as another professor said Dr. Michael Meyer, Yesh Gavul, there are limits. There are limits to Jewish belief. You can't say, well, my Jewish belief is, God is, I don't know, purple octopus. Well, you're entitled to believe that, but that's not going to get very far in any discussions that we have. I don't think, unless one can describe what it is about a purple octopus that you feel is divine. But you see where I'm going with this. There are, we still, reason, I think, is necessary in any approach. Anything that we decide or believe or think about, reason is necessary, but I don't believe it's sufficient. And I think this is what was going on with Harold Schulweis. His reason and logic is impeccable. It's impeccable, but it doesn't allow to go beyond reason and say, well, how does it make you feel? Or we had, for example, one of our first graders for Shabbat. They were doing the Langston Hughes poem, I Believe a World. And this one student said, I believe a world where there's magic. And I think it put a smile on everybody's face, right? Because there is a level of the human condition where we want to have mystery. We want to have, at least I want to have, I'll speak for myself. I want to live in a world of enchantment. I don't believe in fairies and goblins and things like that, but I want to believe in a world that is enchanted. I want to live in a world where trees are alive and the sky is alive. And back to Mordecai Kaplan's phrase, where we're experiencing life abundant. And I do think with some of these theologies that just rely on reason, it's like the quote, what Hamlet said to Horatio, there's more in heaven and earth that's dreamt of in your philosophy. Right? Horatio was a strict empiricist, logical, reasonable, and trying to understand how could there be Hamlet's ghost or his father's ghost. And Hamlet's response was, there's more in heaven and earth that's dreamt of in your philosophy. And I want to live in a world that allows for that possibility. I don't want reason to be the be all and end all and have the final say, because there's stuff we just don't know. And to have some humility and recognize there's still mystery, there's still stuff we don't know, and we're still discovering what's in this world and in this universe. And if we come to discover that there are angels, great. That makes for a bigger, more enchanted world. Oh my goodness, there are angels. How can you relate to an angel? How can you interact with an angel? And in Judaism and the Jewish mystical tradition, there are ways to do that. There are prayers to do that. There are meditations to invoke angels. Are we going to shut that down and say, well, that's not reasonable. That's not, I can't sense that. We can't put that under a microscope. That's an approach. If you want to take it, you're welcome to that approach. But like I say, for me personally, I want to go beyond reason. I want reason to be necessary and there, but not sufficient. There's more to it. Yeah, Carol.
I don't want to speak again if there are other people. Sheila's not muted and Philip's not muted. And
oh, that's right. I'm sorry. Sheila did have her hand up, Carol.
I was just, well,
yeah, so
when
Sheila,
Seth,
then Carol.
When Seth was speaking about knowing, it seemed to be different than believing. It seemed to me that I don't see the difference. If you think you know God, then that means you have a belief that there is a God. I feel you express it so well, Rabbi, that having a mystery in the world and a power beyond is very enriching, personally. I mean, there's a lot of good people, and there's no way to prove it. I don't think you can't prove empirically or any other way. It's just, you want to or you don't. And
Yeah.
that sort of was what I was thinking when Seth mentioned, you know, that seemed to be that there was a difference between knowing and believing.
All right. Well, thank you, Sheila. I think that's a really good point. And as you expressed, it's sort of a choice that we make, whether to believe or not believe, whether it's to know or not to know. It's sort of, they're related, and we're making a choice. We're making decisions about how we think the world works. It's a choice. Yeah, Carol.
First of all, Sheila, I think that you can have faith without knowing, that you can believe and acknowledge that you don't know. So I don't think it's knowing and then believing. I think it's believing and then understanding that you don't know. But what I wanted to comment on is I have very great trouble with a supernatural God. I don't know what that means. Okay. I loved the I'm trying to go back and see who it was. Well, anyway, I'm an anti-dualist. To me, God is everything and everywhere, and I don't try to understand. I just, that helps me deal with life and with the world. But then I run into a problem with Kushner, because if God is every place and in everything, then while it may be true that God doesn't cause disease, violence, earthquakes, car accidents, but God has to be in there someplace, because God is in everything. So, I mean, I don't know if it's like the guy walking down the street who gets hit by a car, he has a broken leg, he's down on the ground and he says, "Thank you, God." And he says, "Thank you, God," because it wasn't any worse than it was. I don't know if that's the way to look at the disease, violence, earthquakes, but that's not terribly comforting to me. I do believe God is in there someplace. I'm just not sure where.
Yeah, and it's okay to, it's okay not to have all the answers, right? Part of sometimes, I mean, in Judaism, sometimes it's the question. And I know that sounds like a cliche and that sounds trite, but at a certain level, philosophers and theologians have been wrestling with suffering and evil and these things, and how do we know there's a God and what proof is there? They've been wrestling with this for thousands of years. Some of the greatest minds on the planet have been wrestling with these very things, and nobody has come up with all the answers that tie it all into a bow and make it all make sense. Nobody's done that. And so each one of these theologies lacks something. Each one of these theologies can lead to a critique. And it's what do you want to live with? I don't think we're going to get to 100%. 100% logical, 100% answers all the questions, reasonable, no more, criticism or question about it. I think we're going to get there. But I think where we can get is in looking at various theologies, which one resonates with you when you read it or when you study it and say, yes, that theologian, that Jewish philosopher just expressed something that I believe or that I affirm or that I think is true to life. I think when we can find those teachings and those Jewish theologies, then we're on to something. Then we've got something that we can hang our, theological, religious, spiritual hat on and go into further, let's study them some more, if Mordecai Kaplan, if some of his ideas resonate with you, I can give you, hundreds of pages of his books. I can give you his books. If Harold Schulweis resonated with you, we'll look at Heschel and Buber. If they resonate with you, thank God we've got their teachings written down, and we can explore further and continue to ask questions. And where I think we might get at the end of all of our questioning is we still questions, and I think that's we're in good company. We're in good company. Who was it? Socrates? It said a wise person is somebody who knows how much they don't know. So for Socrates was one of the wisest people on the earth, and he said, I know how much I don't know. We are in very good company. Yeah, Louise, did you have your hand up? Or was that Maggie? Maggie, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think we're set up for all this because in the Torah, God has hands and has feet and all this and yet has nothing, and so we have over the years made up these things about what that is, but the Torah doesn't really give us much help. The Spirit of God flows around, and you can look at my back when I pass you by, but what does that mean, a back? How does God have a back?
Yeah, that's a good point. So we have, and Maggie, it's a really good point. We have in a rich literature of a lot of descriptions of God, a lot of portraits of God, a lot of, ways of talking about God. And some of them are very concrete and very anthropomorphic, sort of human characteristics for God, and anthropopathic, human feelings ascribed to God. And it's this very rich literature. And alongside that, as Maggie's saying, we've also got the mystery. We've also got this sense of, God is ultimately unknowable. And we try to fill in the picture. We, through our own experiences or through Jewish history or through nature, we find things that touch us, that move us. And we help sort of add to who God is, what God is, how we understand God. It's all human beings trying to make sense of our lives and make sense of the world. And so, yeah, we've got this rich tradition and many different pictures, portraits, ways of talking about God. So it's a great point, Maggie. Let's take a look at now some of these theologies, because we're going to now look at some other ways that Heschel and Buber talked about God that, again, we might say, oh, that's what makes sense to me. That's what resonates with me. So hopefully you all have the handout. And if not, I'm going to share my screen. Oh, I'm sorry. You don't have the handout because I didn't give it to you. So let me do this. Let me place the handout in the chat box. And give me one sec, everybody. Okay, here is the handout in the chat box. It's on its way. There it is. So hopefully you can click on that and open that up in the chat box. If you can't open it up in the chat box, I'm going to share my screen. And just email me if you weren't able to open it up, and I'll send it to you. But in sharing my screen, if I can find it, here it is. Can everybody see that okay? Can everybody see my screen okay? So Heschel's theology is something that he once called depth theology. Depth theology. And we're going to take a look at what he meant by that. Who would like to read Heschel's first, this first teaching that comes from one of his famous books, God in Search of Man? And please forgive the gender specific language. You know, these 20th century Jewish philosophers use the word man all the time to refer to humanity itself. Would somebody like to read about awe preceding faith? Yeah, Tina, thank you.
Awe precedes faith. It is at the root of faith. We must grow in awe in order to reach faith. Awe rather than faith is the cardinal attitude of the religious Jew.
All right, thank you, Tina. So let me stop the share for a second and we can just think about that. Awe rather than faith is the cardinal attitude of the religious Jew. This is what Heschel meant by depth theology. You have to dig deeper than faith, and what you will find underneath it is a sense of awe, a sense of wonder. The term that Heschel used was radical amazement. When we experience the world, there are moments where we're just struck, and the way that he described it is we are in a sense of radical amazement. And the famous story about Heschel is he'd go to his classes with his rabbinical students, and he'd say, "Did you all see the miracle that happened today?" And they're like, "What miracle?" And he would say, it was nighttime, he'd say, "The sun set. The sunset, that miracle." So for Heschel, he was just infused by this sense of awe and wonder and depth of experience, a depth of sensory experience, intellectual experience, emotional experience. And it is that sense of awe, this sense of, wow, look at that. He felt that's what is the first level of religion. That is foundational, the root level of religion is that sense of awe. Has anybody experienced that sense of awe? And this goes back to, perhaps, let me answer it this way, ask it this way, the handout that you all received for the first class, when and where do you experience God's presence? And I wonder if people want to share when and where you experience God's presence, and that might link in some way to Heschel's depth theology. Does anybody want to share where and when they experience? Susan?
Question is, how do you experience God if you don't know if you believe in God?
Okay, so maybe another way of saying that is, when and where do you experience a sense of awe, a sense of mystery, a sense of wow, this is in the world?
Probably when Andrew was born.
Sure. How many people feel that way? The birth of a child or a grandchild, right? Right, Susan? Do you remember when Andrew was born? Do you remember something about what happened in the room or when you first saw him? Do you have that image still in your mind?
Sort of.
Okay.
It was a very long process. I remember that. But it was just, I think just watching him grow, and I'm sure this is like this for most parents, that you give birth to this little thing, who 28 and a half years later is this big human being who does things and stuff like that. And it still inspires awe in me and what he's capable of.
Yeah. Yeah, what a child is capable of, what a human being is capable of. I mean, that I think, for some that is a tremendously sacred contemplation and reflection. I remember when Evan was born, because April, it was a C-section, both Evan and Nina, and April was in recovery. So I was the first parent to see Evan. And I remember he was in this like incubation machine because I guess he needed to cook a little bit more. And so Evan was in the incubation machine, and I was in that room with him. And I'll never forget, never, it's imprinted, it's emblazoned on my brain, on my mind, seeing Evan there and his eyes, and Evan was looking around and sort of looking for somebody. And, I caught his gaze, I watched him looking, and I'll never, ever forget that moment. And by the way, Evan's always been very observant, and I think it goes back to that. He's always had that in him, extremely observant. And there was that moment, he was just taking in this, where am I? What, he was just taking it all in. And yeah, one of the most sacred moments I've ever experienced in my life. Absolutely. And again, do I put God there? Yes, I put God in that ability of human birth and the relationship between parent and child and the ability of a child to grow. Now, other people might say, I see that, it's awesome, it's great. Not necessarily God. That's fine too. So that's why I think it depends on the word that we use. If we substitute sacred or awesome, or wonder, if we substitute those words for God, Heschel would say that's what it's all about. I mean, he'd say more than that. I mean, he'd say, but that's the beginning. That's where it all, that's the whole birth of the religious impulse, is that moment that when Andrew was born. That's the whole birth of the religious impulse right there. Yeah, Philip?
Further on the subject of Andrew, and this just occurred to me, what he's accomplished, despite, because of whatever, of his autism. I mean, when he was first diagnosed and we were going through all the challenges, we really didn't know if he'd be able to talk in complete sentences. And now everybody knows Andrew talks a lot. And I know parents, who have spoken to, who said, I spent $200,000 in speech therapy. My kid can talk all day long. I don't want them to be quiet. But to see what he's accomplished and what he's able to do and his degree of independence in relation to what we were going through and not knowing any of this is certainly a sense of awe. And one could say, well, it's what you did as parents or what he's able to do, on his own. But I think it's a combination of everything and then some other divine something that has to have a hand in it.
Thank you, Philip. What a beautiful way to express it. And just along those lines, and Leonard, wanted to get your comment too. One of my favorite sermons by Harold Schulweis, and I've done variations of it in my own way, is he talked about the two main names for God. Elohim, right at the beginning of the Torah, that's the word that's used for all the creation that takes place, is Elohim, Elohim. That, it's used at least 10 times. God says, and it's always Elohim. So maybe it's used 14 or 15 times. That's the world that is. That's the natural world. That's what is. But then he said the name Adonai, the most sacred name for God in Judaism, the most personal name for God, is what is possible. So you have Elohim, what is. You have Adonai, what is possible. And for many theologians, God is very much related to what is possible. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah, Leonard.
being raised in a Jewish family, I had two examples in front of me. You know, I can look back over the years and see one was going to Cheder and watching my parents. One in Cheder in Hebrew school, the interpretation of the Bible was always that God spoke to all these people, spoke to Moses, spoke to a lot of other people, and they took that literally. They're supposed to do something, or they were praised or whatever, and they took God at his word. My dad was a member of Jewish war veterans and stuff, so he'd always schlep me along with him to go and donate blood a couple times a year and do other things that they did for the home for the aged and Jewish home for the aged and stuff like that. And you learn that Jewish men did things like that. That's just, you try to lead kind of a righteous life. I had an experience about 48 years ago, which was the most difficult time in my life I've been going through for several years. And I'd gone back to college to learn Spanish because I thought that would fix my problems. I graduated school several years before that. And I heard a speaker that night. So it was at a meeting in the basement of a church that guy that was in my class suggested I go to with him. He was in AA, and he thought maybe my problem was alcohol and drugs. And I wound up going to a meeting with him, and I had an experience that night. I heard a speaker who I identified with, and during the course of the meeting, it was immediately afterwards, I was sitting in the middle of the room, and I heard the voice in my head speak to me, and it said, "Leonard, you're home. These people understand you." And it was clear, crisp. I'd never heard the voice in my head speak to me like that before. And I know that was God speaking to me. I didn't know it at the moment, but it was the only way I could assimilate. That's what transpired over the course of that later that evening. That was God speaking to me, and it had a profound effect on my life. It changed my life. I wound up getting sober, and that was 48 and a half years ago. And I have no doubts about that was my experience, that God spoke to me. I've had a couple experiences similar to that over the years, and I don't always believe so profoundly in God, but I try to live a life that I exemplify those kind of values of being kind of a righteous person. I love the Jewish story about, is it the 26 men who God would destroy the world if they weren't just 26 just men in the world, and they don't know who they are. So it's incumbent on all of us to live a good life and be good to others and stuff. And sometimes I think that may sound silly, but that's the values that how I base my life on. And I have no doubts that God spoke to me that moment in my life. And it's stayed with me profoundly my whole life. And I've seen other people have similar experiences. And that's important to me too, where something has happened and God had intervened in their life and turned them around.
Mm-hmm. Thank you thank you for sharing that, Leonard. Yeah, there's a very powerful experience and a voice that speaks truth and that is transformative in your life. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, very powerful. All right, why don't let's take a look at one or two other things by Heschel, and then we'll go to Martin Buber. So I'm gonna share my screen again, and you've got it too. Let me see. I lost it. I lost my share screen. Here it is. Okay. For Heschel, God was very personal, and and there was a strong emotional component to his understanding of God, and certainly awe is an emotion. That sense of awe and wonder, it's an emotional it's a feeling. He says that prophecy consists in the proclamation of the divine pathos, expressed in the language of the prophets as love, mercy, or anger. Behind the various manifestations of God's pathos is one motive, one need, the divine need for human righteousness. Now, I share this because in some ways, Leonard, it's sort of back to your idea of the Lamed Vavniks, the 36 righteous people who keep the world spinning and keep everything going and to do good works, to do good things in this world, because we may be one of those 36. But this idea of divine pathos, that was a famous expression by Heschel. So when Heschel looked at the Bible and looked at the prophets, he saw a God who had emotion, who felt, a God who loved and yearned and got angry and laughed and cried and the full gamut of human emotions. That is expressed in our tradition, that God having those emotions as well. And for Heschel, that was just so important. And I think, for a number of people, that's what allows us to resonate with, the character of God, the person of God in the Jewish Bible, that God is sort of like us and feels like us and gets angry where we might get angry too, or is sad where we might be sad, and is joyful and laughs where we might laugh. And that makes God very, in the Bible, very relatable, accessible. It allows for a real soulfulness, right? That God's got soul in the Bible, these deep emotions, these yearnings that we also experience. Now, on one level, we could say, well, that's ridiculous to say that God's like that. That's just a glorified human being we're making God out to be. Or one could say, this is our human way. As the rabbis say, that the Torah speaks in the language of human beings. This is our human way of having experience and saying, that this is how we understand God. That when something like this happens in the world, we can picture or imagine that this is how God would respond, the way that we at our best might respond. That God cares, right? God frees the Jewish people from slavery, and there's some midrashim, and even in the Bible, it says in I believe in Deuteronomy, that God says, I bore you on eagle's wings. What an incredibly powerful metaphor. That and like an eagle, it's my understanding, I don't know a lot about eagles, but it's my understanding that that's how an eagle teaches its children, its young, to fly, by carrying them on the back and on their wings, so that they learn to be able to fly themselves. And that when the Torah says that God bore us on eagle's wings, what a touching, beautiful imagery from nature that is in our tradition that we can, learn from. That, God cares about us, that God loves us, that God is a parent to us, or so for Heschel, it was these descriptions of God's pathos, God's feeling, God's love, God's care, that were so powerful in his way of relating to God, and maybe they're powerful in our way of relating to God. And again, we could see it as metaphor. We don't have to take it literally. I don't think Heschel took it literally. I think he saw that as a metaphor for understanding how God operates in the world and how God operates in our lives. This is a human way of grasping the infinite. And it's the best we can do, and it's pretty good. I mean, I think to say that God bore us on eagle's wings is pretty good metaphor. Poetic, powerful, says a lot. So that's Heschel: depth, awe, wonder, amazement, divine pathos, feeling, emotion, sensory as well as emotion. And by the way, Heschel was a PhD philosopher, brilliant mind. This was not a guy who just focused on his feelings. This was a guy who focused on his mind and on his heart and on his sensory experiences, and sort of synthesized it all together. So, and very poetic, very soulful, Heschel's writing. So if some of these writings of Heschel resonate with you, I take a look at his original books. There are anthologies of Heschel. Let me give you one of my favorites. It's called The Wisdom of Heschel. It's an anthology of like his greatest hits. And it's called The Wisdom of Heschel. You can find it on Amazon or Barnes and Noble or at a local bookstore, I think. It's edited by Ruth Marcus Goodhill. Ruth Goodhill is the editor or the collector of this. And, you can just read one passage after another and just be stunned by his poetry and what he's saying. So that's Heschel. Let's talk about Buber for a second. I got my eye on the clock. It's 8:12. So for Buber, also a philosopher, and knew Heschel. They were friendly. Buber brought Heschel into some of the Jewish adult education programs that they had in Germany before the Nazis took over and didn't allow him to teach. So Buber was a little bit older than Heschel, but colleagues, contemporaries, friends, and he had this philosophy of relationship. It's called the philosophy of dialogue, and he related it to God. So let's take a look at what Buber had to say. So give me another second as I share the screen. Here we go. Hopefully y'all can see that. I'm just going to do this really quickly, and then we can discuss it. I want to give us a chance to discuss it. Buber's most famous work, difficult to read, very poetic, very artistic, very, it's very hard to understand. But when you read it, you can get the gist of a lot of it. Buber famously said in his book, I and Thou, all real living is meeting. Carol, I don't know if you felt that way about your board meeting last week, but meeting in the sense of relationship, meaning in a very deep way. And I'm going to unpack a little bit of this in just a moment, but I want to take a couple of these things together, and then I'm going to unpack it. So all real living is meeting. In the beginning is relation. I love that. He's definitely riffing on, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. He's totally riffing on the beginning of the Torah, and he's modifying it or expanding upon it to say, in the beginning is relation. Every thou in the world is by its nature fated to become a thing. So let's talk about those three things. I'm going to try to unpack it. So for Martin Buber, there are two ways for us to interact with the world. Two main ways for us to interact with the world: as an I-thou, an I-you relationship, or as an I-it relationship. An I-thou relationship is made up of openness, directness, being fully present in the moment of the interaction. It's a sense of mutuality, a sense of equality. An I-thou is a true relationship or dialogue between equals. So we relate to the world in an I-thou. We can relate to nature that way, animals that way, people that way. Anything in this world we can have an I-thou relationship with if we encounter that thing in a spirit of openness, directness, presentness, It's almost like Heschel-like, in that we're not analyzing it and when we're trying to dissect it, which is important. But before we get there, it's just a sense of wow. It's a sense of taking in the other completely. That's I, you, that's I, thou. I, it, equally important, is using something as a means to an end. Relating to things in this world as a means to an end. So, for example, we probably, when we, go to a restaurant, when it's safe for you to go to a restaurant, and we ask the waiter to take our food order, we can schmooze with the waiter and say, hi, how you doing? And how is it going? And are you staying safe? That's an I-you relationship. But at a certain point, we're going to turn that into an I-it relationship. Okay, this is what I want for dinner. I'm expecting you to go get it for me. That's not an equal relationship. That is we are using somebody as a means to an end, and the end is to get dinner. So for Buber, we go back and forth between this in the way that we interact with the world. I, you, I, thou is a little bit more poetic, so I'll say I, thou, I, it. There's nothing wrong with I, it. Now, if we only relate to things as I, it, then there's a problem. But I, it in itself there's nothing evil in that. It's what we have to do. When we analyze something, when we try to understand it, we're analyzing God concepts. That's an I, it relationship, right? When we engage these texts and just, let them wash over us and take them in, and we're not being critical of it, that's more I, you. But once we turn it into, wait, does this make sense? Is this my experience? Wait, but how do you account for evil? How do you account for this? Does this leave me cold? That's I, it. And there's nothing wrong with it. We need that. That is the basis of all science. That is the basis of all art. That is the basis of all human creation, is taking an I, you, an I, thou, and turning it into an I, it. Now, hopefully we turn it back into an I, thou, and it's a dynamic process. Does that make sense? Okay. It's hard to understand. It's sort of very heady stuff. Anything. So if it doesn't make sense, what doesn't make sense about that? That we're relating to everything in the world in one of two ways: I, thou, I, it. Being completely open to it, getting some distance from it. In an I, it, we're getting distance from it. The example that Buber gives is he was stroking a horse when he was a kid. He lived on a farm with his grandfather. His grandfather had horses. He was stroking the horse. And he was taking in the horse as a living being, a full equal to Buber. And he was in an I, thou moment with the horse. And then he caught himself having an I, thou moment. And he said, oh, I'm stroking the horse. Look at that. The horse feels like this. How long have I been doing this? Maybe I should go have lunch. He turned it into an I, it, which we have to do. You can't live in I, thou eternally. You cannot, as a human being, we can't live in I, thou eternally. We have to turn it into I, it. Yeah, Mark?
Well, I guess I was stuck on trying to conceive of an I, thou with an inanimate object. But maybe that's why people had pet rocks. I don't know.
Well, it may be harder to do it with an inanimate object. I think for Buber, and we'd have to explore a little bit more, but he was talking about living beings for the most part. Trees, animals, nature, human beings. And then he said, when we are in the I, thou moment with any living being, that God, the eternal thou, partakes of that. And so let's now look back at what Buber said about this. sharing the screen. I'm sorry, that's the wrong thing. I'm going to stop that. This is what I'm looking for. Okay, can you see that? So, and this is, so we talked about the first three, and now when he says, let's talk about God. By the term God, I mean not a metaphysical idea. So Eric Fromm thought God was an idea, not an idea, nor a moral idea. That was a little bit of Harold Schulweis, predicate theology, that God is this, you know, and for Schulweis, it was more than that, but his focus on predicate theology was the morality of God. Nor as a moral idea or a moral construct, nor a projection of a psychic or social image. That God is not something we're projecting from our human experience out into the world, nor anything at all created by or developed within human beings, that God is not just inside of us, not just a human creation. But these ideas and images are not the work of free creation. They are products of divine human, I'm sorry, nor anything at all created by or developed within human beings. I do mean God, whom human beings, however, possess. I'm sorry, maybe I didn't do this right.
I think it's just that it should be possess, not possesses, because they
Okay.
probably said man possesses.
Okay, right. Yeah, you're right. I was changing his language because it's all about man. I do mean God, human beings, however, possess. I'm sorry. You know, I added this last line just within the past, 30 minutes before I began, and I'm actually confused myself. But here's where I want to get to. They are, by God, they are humanity's attempt to grasp the inexplicable as when it happens to him or her. So by God, these are divine human encounters and our attempt to grasp the inexplicable as when it happens to him or her. They are traces of the mystery. So divine human encounters are traces of the mystery. So this is getting back to, for Buber, God is experienced, and actually it was Harold Schulweis, who was a great student of Buber and who did his master's thesis, I think, at Columbia on Buber. So here's Schulweis, this guy who seems to be more of a humanist, talking about Buber. He said, for Buber, God is not in you or in me, but God is found in between us. God is the encounter, the divine human encounter. God is found in between. And there are books of other people who've analyzed Buber. It's very difficult to understand, and that's why I just got tripped up a second ago. I have to look back at what I actually, typed out from the book and say, wait, is that what it meant to type out? But that the eternal thou is between a human being and another human being, is in between a human being and an animal, is in between a human being and a tree. The eternal thou is found between you and your pet. When you experience your pet fully as an equal, and you're just, you're not analyzing the pet or being, you're just fully taking in the essence of your pet. You're fully open to their aliveness and their uniqueness and who they are in that moment, that God is found in that moment. And has anybody had an I thou experience, an eternal thou experience with a pet?
Yes.
Right, Jill? Yeah? Yeah, do you want to say anything more about that?
This is a secret.
Okay, it's a secret, so we'll keep it. We can keep it a secret.
Okay, so.
Or I mean, if you want to, if you know, if I don't want, if you're not comfortable saying, please don't feel like you've got to. Express it.
No, I have a wonderful dog now, Penny, but the love of my life in terms of dogs was my 17-year-old German Shepherd.
Yeah.
That dog was really took me through some very difficult times when I was going through my divorce. And I always refer to him as my son, my first son.
Yeah.
That dog was amazing and took care of me. And I had an experience where I was going down into the arroyo when I was younger, in my late 20s, early 30s, maybe it was in my 30s. And I was decided to take some time to go for a picnic by myself. I had the day off. It was a beautiful day. And it was probably pretty silly that I did this, but I went down into the park. And if you've been down into the arroyo, you can only go one way down. You have to go back up the same way from where I was. And I saw some guys coming down. This was when people used to wear chains on their jeans and stuff like that. I thought, they don't look too good. I better leave. So I packed everything up, and my dog and I went up, and he sensed it, and he threw his 70-pound, they pulled a knife on me, and he said the guys, and my dog sensed it as it was happening and threw his body on these guys, and they ran away. Yeah, I would say I had a definite high-down experience with that dog.
Class with Rabbi Schechter.
Yeah, your dog might have saved your life.
Yeah, so I love dogs. I think I'm so glad you brought that up, because
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble.
Well, yeah, and it was James Joyce who wrote in one of his books or one of his short stories that there's a reason that God is dog spelled backwards.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And James Joyce said that. Absolutely. So to experience another living being in the fullness of their being, and you were mentioning too, Jill, that dog was your dog was your equal, and in that sense, one might even say more than an equal.
Oh,
right?
I think he was
Saved your life.
I think he was my protector in many ways, and I'll just keep this really brief, but he lasted a long time until he was 17. And I had a friend, this is crazy, I know you guys are going to think I'm crazy, but I worked with her. She was a psychologist, and she said she was kind of like a psychic. So I had her come and, sort of when my dog was really sick, and she said, he's waiting for you to, he's waiting for you to let him go, because he wants to know you're going to be okay after he leaves. I don't know if that was true or not, but I believed her.
Well, like I say, more things in heaven and earth.
Yeah.
And if you ever get a chance, listen to Oprah Winfrey. You can find it on YouTube. She's talking to a Jewish psychiatrist named Brian Weiss. And I talked about Brian Weiss, I believe, in last year's, Jewish Views of the Afterlife. And Brian Weiss has done thousands of, past life regressions, and Yale-trained doc, very rational. And then he realized things were happening in this world that he had no rational explanation for, and he had to change his worldview. And that was a challenge to him. He had to now incorporate new information into a worldview that he did not experience before. And so Oprah's talking to Brian Weiss on YouTube, and Oprah's saying, I had these two little dogs. I think one was named Solomon, I forget the other name, and they died. And she said she was deeply grieving when they had died. And she said, I spent more time with them than any other living being, including, I forget who's Oprah's boyfriend's name. What's his name again?
I forgot.
But who I'm talking about, that guy.
Yeah.
So she said, I spent...
Stedman.
Stedman, that's right. So she said, I spend more time with those dogs than any other living being. And she said, I was deeply grieving their loss. Yeah. And then I realized at some point, after I went through the, all the grief and all the sadness and sense of loss, I realized that they were now a sweet little spirit that was always with me. And, it makes you want to cry because it's expressing the level of love and relationship, the Buberian sense of I, thou, that Oprah was articulating and was making now sense of their physical absence, that they're still spiritually with me. And by the way, I think too, and Maggie, you might have got this before I did.
He just
Maggie may have had
left,
to leave.
Rabbi.
Yeah, she may have had to leave. But I think
Yeah.
what Buber was saying was, I do mean God who human beings possess in ideas and images. So right, when we talk about God, we have an image, we have an idea in our head about what that means. But Buber would say, those are products of our encounters. It's not just from in here. It's the way we're interacting with the world that is outside of us and that transcends us, and that, as he says, is part of the mystery. So again, in both Heschel and Buber, a sense of awe, a sense of wonder, a sense of mystery, a deep way of interacting with the world and interacting with other beings, and putting God into that and saying God is a part of that experience that we have. Another way of understanding this. So it's 8:32. I appreciate we went a little bit over. Do we have a few more minutes? Any questions about these two other Jewish theologians? Any questions about that? Okay, well, I wanted to leave on one note, and I wrote it out because I really, first of all, I want to thank you all for these 3 weeks together. I hope it's been meaningful, and I hope it's, you've been introduced to a God concept that you haven't maybe studied before. If you have studied before, you're seeing it in a new way. And I just wanted to end sort of like how I began, by saying I want to encourage you to be open and curious about your own experiences with the sacred, with the divine, with these moments of awe and wonder and relationship, that you continue to be open and curious to such a deep experiences, and maybe even talk about it with people who you feel safe talking about, and that you won't be judged by sharing some of the things. And thank you, everybody, for sharing tonight some very personal experiences of the sacred and the divine, and continue to talk about that in places where you feel safe to do so and you're not going to be judged. And please remember, as we said at the beginning, there is no one right way to think about God in Judaism. There never has been one right way to do it. There are many legitimate, acceptable, diverse Jewish approaches to the divine. And I do think that one of our spiritual tasks in life is to discover the approach that works best for you. That you discover the approach to God, to the divine, to the sacred, to whatever you believe about this world. You discover the approach that works best for you, and that's authentic to you, and that you can believe in, and that you can affirm freely without coercion or feeling like you have to think of it or believe or feel in this way. And if you don't believe anything related to God, that's okay too, as we've talked about, because ultimately I think Judaism is not about faith in God, although that is a big piece if you want it. But I think Judaism is ultimately about faith in those things that do make the world a better place and that enhance life for all living beings. So that Judaism is ultimately about ways of being in this world, that, to borrow a phrase from Mordechai Kaplan, which I mentioned last Shabbat, ways of being that lead to life abundant for you, and life abundant for all people, and life abundant for all living beings. and for all the world. I think that's ultimately our task in Judaism. And by talking about God and experiencing God and doing this, that helps us on that path. And like our ancestors, we're on a journey of discovery. And my prayer is that you and I, that we're blessed on that journey. And thank you so much for being a part of this month's leg of our journey together. And we're going to continue to journey together in many, many ways. So I want to thank you all again for being a part of the journey and sharing. And if there's anything that you'd like to share now, we can spend a couple, minute or two sharing or wishing each other well.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Anybody else? Any questions, comments?
I
Food
wanted
for
to
thought?
thank Leonard for, I don't know if he's still here.
Yeah, he's still here.
I wanted to really thank you for what you shared. It really was beautiful, very moving. And I know that that was probably hard for you to share. It was really a beautiful story. I want to thank you, Rabbi, for just, I know that I probably speak for everyone, but I love listening to you. Every time I hear you, I realize you're very wise and well read, but you come off as just a regular guy, so smart that it's like amazing to me every time. Oh my gosh, this guy is so smart.
Oh, well, thank you, Jill. I appreciate that. And we're all learning, we're all growing, and I do think that to me, what I love about Judaism is it encourages us to grow, it encourages us to learn, and to pursue wisdom. That wisdom, chokhmah, is a great value in Judaism, and as it says in Proverbs, it's more precious than rubies. No treasure can match it.
That's the beauty of Judaism, that we are encouraged to ask questions. And I think that's why we're still here.
Yeah.
I think you're right.
Continuing to ask the questions and to keep creating Torah together and keeping this alive and adding to our understanding of God and our understanding of what Judaism is. We scratched the surface. There are so many more Jewish theologies, and they're great Jewish female theologians that I wish I would have had time to get to. But these were the ones that I wanted to present. And if we had more time, we talk about Judith Plaskow. But I am glad that we talked Tova Spitzer. We talked about God as metaphor for the perplexed. We got some great female theology from Tova Spitzer, and look for her book coming out about God as metaphor in the next year.
We know you're terribly sexist. And I would like to say, particularly for me being away, it's wonderful and heartwarming to see so many people that we know and love, and to be able to share. It means so much. So thank you.
It's great to see you.
Yeah, it's
Just
great to see you. Thank you for being with us, Carol. Please join us again when you're not involved in the activities of your congregation there, and we'd love to see you again. All the best to you and the family. And Mark, and to yeah, because I was looking at Carol and I was like, yeah, there's Mark. Well, so thank you all. So, we're going to continue our spiritual nourishment and connection once a month. I don't know when the next one is. We're going to journey through the Bible. We'll continue our adult ed journey through the Bible, monthly lunch and learn, and we'll continue to learn together and grow together and continue to ask great questions and share great insights together. So thank you all again.
Thank you. Thank you so
Rabbi.
much.
You.
Rabbi.
You are most welcome. You're
Thank
most
you.
welcome. Thanks,
See you
everybody.
tomorrow.
Thank you. Right. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye.